I'm going to talk a little bit about writing and about my process so people can understand where I'm coming from. And maybe it'll be of some use to writers, both amateur and maybe those who are already writing. Uh, the truth is, though, I've never been published much, so take it for what it's worth, a grain of salt and a pinch of pepper. But I'm working on my universe for kind of a long time, about 2 decades, and it's just been a hobby of mine. uh, while I did my own thing in my life. And it's one of those things where, they talk about a trunk novel, and I have a trunk saga. Just kind of sat there and continued to grow. I've added nuances and parts and pieces over time. And I hope that someday it'll get out there. And in a way, right now, I'm trying to do that through the comic book that I've did a crowdfunding for on Indiegogo. And for those of you who are interested, that's called Little Girl Lethal. So, how do you build a world that can be inhabited in a way by other people and be enjoyed because of how your characters have interact with the world that you were building? How does that process take place? And there's a whole lot of theory about how to write, and basically there's the plotters and the pantsers. And I personally think that if you're going to do some sort of creative endeavor like this and within writing, you need to have some of the skills needed to craft good literature. Now, I'm not trying to push anybody out of trying to do that, because that is not, will never be my intention. If you want to be creative, be creative. And the only way to do that, just like riding a bike, just like, learning any skill, takes practice. And you have to put tools in your toolbox to accomplish that goal. And sometimes it starts young, sometimes you can start late in life, and sometimes you have an innate talent to craft that way, like any artist. Now, writing is not an easy thing to do. Some will argue what the most difficult type of writing is, and I'd say that every type of writing has its own challenges, and uh, others that make it more enjoyable, other nuances, other assets. I don't know if that's the right word. Um, to being the type of writing that a certain individual would like. You know, writing prose, long form fiction. Uh, you better know what you're doing in the sense of crafting plot, because you can get off in the weeds and tangenting, and it just becomes an incoherent mess if you don't do it properly. If you don't bring all those threads back into a resolution, at least at the end of the book, or um, where you're cutting off for that book, if it's a series of books. Um, that's the biggest thing that usually happens. And if you're going to pants, well, let me define that term. Writing by the seat of your pants, essentially. You dive in, you start writing, and see where it goes. Um, Good examples of that for most people would be like Stephen King style. But here's the thing: if you want to pants as opposed to plot, which means you would make a structure and build this framework and then lay everything on top of it, you best know how to have that innate sense of where a story is going while you're pantsing. Because if you don't, it's just going to wander around and people are going to not know where you're going. And if you have any threads that go off in other directions, or you tend to go off there and it gets off the main plot, um, if you don't know how to bring it back, then people will be a little annoyed with your writing. And if you decide to publish without, say, any editorial to tell you that these things need to be fixed, um, you might not find that it sells very well. That's not to say it won't. You might find your niche audience, but in general, no. People have their own innate sense of storytelling. It's almost down to the basal DNA of us, going back to the campfires of our, you know, primitive origins where people would tell stories of the day's events to relay the information that happened to them, and travelers would come, and if they were let into the group to tell the stories, the old bards, as it were, they would tell stories and people would listen, and they'd start to feel something within them because they knew a good story when they heard it. Hopefully, that basal DNA, that very essence that is us of the storyteller, is down there for you to tell a story. However, that doesn't mean to say that people didn't craft their stories in such a way to entice one to hear it. You're going to tell something of a banal nature, you better flower it up a little bit so that people want to listen to it or look at it, depending on what medium you're using. Not everybody's going to have a fun time looking at a story about somebody gardening. However, if you make that story about, well, let me think of something. Let me try to come up with an idea. If the gardener is, say, the god of the garden, and he tells a story about the plants interacting and how some things need to be cultivated, and they have to be, lines have to be drawn within the world of the garden, and you got the rows, and say those are the countries, and there are different plants that don't interact very well, and others that get along, so you can put them next to each other for whatever reason, roots and cross-pollination or something like that. You may be able to create a story from that, kind of meta narrative that actually is teaching people how to garden, and didn't have a funny or engaging story out of it. I'm just throwing something out there. And now, that doesn't sound like very exciting to me because, well, I don't have a great green thumb, so why would I want to do that? But if you did, and then you had the ability to tell a story, or you're working with a partner who can tell a story, you put those elements together, and you have an interesting little book about gardening that might inform as well as entertain. That seems to go a lot just to relay information, which is another form of writing where you can just tell people this is how you do it and do it this way. But sometimes that's a little pedantic for people, a little too didactic. All right. We're talking about world building, and so you need a setting usually and an idea. I've seen many an idea in science fiction and in fantasy that sets a world that has rules, and usually that's what you need is rules, and you need to stick to those rules. Some people have been upset lately that the universe of Star Wars has had its rules upset by recent films, especially one. That's why when your fan base, who's loyal to you, sees something that is out of place, it hasn't been implemented or interjected into your story properly so that they can do it in context of your universe, they'll get a little bit upset. So you need to think about those things as well. Now, if you have this base world, you're basically the god of that world in your head. It's all up in your noggin. And you can build it in such a way that as it grows and you foster it and you feed it like a garden, you'll see the fruits of that world start to come out of your head. Your creativity, which is the fertile ground within which you're planting things, to use that metaphor a little farther. And as you see the cities take form, the countries, the landscape, the environment, all these different parts and pieces, environments, there might be multiple. You may have more than one world in your universe, so maybe your universe expands. You have dimensions, and these dimensions touch each other, or they're somehow connected through, a network, whatever you want to call it. You can look at it in many different stories as your world building continues to expand. Now, This can all be plotted out. You can put your points down, and you can say, this is what I'm looking for, and see if it works. If you can put it together in such a way that doesn't cause confusion from one place to the other. Now, if you do have different worlds that you've built within your universe that have conflicting, one inhabitant has a hard time being in another world one world has inhabitants has a hard time being in other worlds and in atmosphere. Those are things that can bring conflict in. That conflict is always good for telling a story and how they deal with that. Your characters. I'll talk about characters maybe another time. Now, my building my world, and I've written many little stories, but my main world that I've constructed over about 2 decades is the world of Lost Peaks. And Lost Peaks is very much like our world, so it's not. Haven't set it on another planet with different species, a different atmosphere with weird biology for the most part. It's an alternate Earth. So many things are very similar and others are very different. But in general, you can understand it if you understand our world, you can kind of get this world. You won't have to suspend your disbelief too much to understand motivations, because people are very human. If you were to go to another world, unless you were making him humanoid and very human-like, if you were going to an alien place or a fantasy place where the rules are very, very different, you have to craft that world for them to inhabit properly. Their rules have to be understood by the reader or the viewer, and then you need to work from that standpoint. And don't play with the rules too much without giving a reason why you're doing it, so that the viewer or the reader can understand why you're doing that. Don't do something just for the cool factor. Don't do something because you want to break out of the box that you've painted yourself in. Find a solution to that box out of it and work from there. So you have your points of your world, and this world, it starts to breathe. And I use that in the description here. You can kind of feel when it becomes alive, because you know what would happen and how things would go. You don't necessarily know how the characters will react, because I mean, you'll be surprised at some of what your creativity will pop out of you in regard to each character that you put in your environment and how they would react. Now, if you find yourself doing the same thing over and over and over using a formula, either you have something that will sell, and people want to have that over and over and over, so that's why you would do it, or you've become stuck in a rut. So you have to shake that off and try to break out of that mold. That's when, this breaking of rules becomes into fore. Well, how would those rules be broken, and how would that fit into your universe? How would that fit into your world, and how would it affect the world that you've crafted if the rules were broken? And why would they do that? Say you're in a standard Earth-like world, and you want to throw off the yoke of everyday mundane things. So you want to make it a magical universe. Well, if you haven't established that it is a magical universe, well, what would happen? What would cause that breaking from the normal reality? And you wanted it magical. Well, so what if let's take Doom. Doom did that. There was an incursion from another dimension of hell beasts, demons. Well, why are they doing that? Do they need souls? So is that why they've created a portal and then thrown the world into its current state? Then you would go from there. Is it that the breakdown of reality? There's barriers in reality, and for some reason they're being broken down, and worlds are coming into conflict because of that. Well, what's that reason behind that? And that doesn't necessarily have to be stated, but it has to be a question that has to be posed, and then the characters within the world have to deal with the consequences of it. Is it natural? Is it unnatural? Is it somebody playing with the nature of these multiple realities that will be coming in contact? Do you have a world that is being invaded by aliens? Well, that's been done many times and for many reasons to many different effects. It's an old trope. These are where the world that you've crafted, that you're using like a base plate, a template of rules, that you change them, and you throw everything into conflict, and then you get story from that. Now, if you have a fantastical world, but you're like, say, like, let's go to Tolkien. Tolkien crafted, he's one of the great world crafters of all time. He has so much literature of his own creation. He created languages and multiple storylines behind the stories until he finally did his epic saga of the Lord of the Rings. And now, you can even buy his musings upon how he was crafting that world. What he was doing was he was setting this epic fantasy in a far-flung universe, a world that became before us, that we've forgotten. And then he did this quest, to the end of an age and the starting of a new one with the saga of the ring. Now, if he had come in there and had spaceships and all this other stuff with no explanation as to why they were there, or just some random modern person popped up and with no explanation and did crazy things and brought a machine gun or whatever it is, people would have, when you're reading it, wouldn't have that same feeling that they do now of that world. It would have been entirely different because you would have been interjecting a new piece in there. And then it would, especially if you did it late in the game, if you'd started at the first part, and see, that might be a cool story. What if you have a fantasy world where some, guy who's an interdimensional traveler from our own world, who's got modern technology, gets thrust into a world where there's orcs and wizards and all this other stuff, and he comes with modern technology and is in there in the mix of it, and he's a fish out of water story. That could be a cool story. I would love to hear that or see that produced in such a way that I'm continuing to want to see more. That's the thing about creating a universe. Once you have somewhere where other people can read or view through whatever medium and be immersed and kind of get out of their everyday drudgery, that's why we create the entertainment we do. And I've done my own creation just kind of for myself until of late, where I really kind of wanted to share it with people. And it's not easy, because when you go back and look at a lot of the things that you've written, you realize that they need the time and polishing and editorial to put it before people. And I'm going to tell you something. If you're doing that, you're never going to be completely satisfied. And so at one point, you're going to have to pull that trigger and just kind of put it out there, see if people like it. And if they enjoy your world that you spent painstaking time crafting. And if I were to give one last bit of advice, you should build as best you can, but realize that, it's never going to be perfect. You're not truly a god. You're the god of your world, but you're not truly a god. So you'll never see all the things that you need to fix. You can just hope that you've done it good enough that when it gets in front of somebody, they can overlook your flaws and keep going because they enjoy the most of what you've done. And once you have that world established for people and they're invested in what you've done, then you can really, start to understand you did a good thing. Even if it's some sort of grimdark, horrible world, mine's kind of like that. It's a world of corruption and vice with a veneer of glitz and glamour, and underneath there's poverty and disparity, and the uber rich and the ultra poor, and they're all within a city that offers everything that you could ever want, but would take it away in a second if you make the wrong mistake. And I've given my character, Sugar Lightspeed, a very tragic background, and her redemption arc, she has one, if it's going to end that way. In the end, she's also unstable, and so things could go very awry. It could end up being a tragic hero. I will hope not, but I mean, I'm not giving away too many things. But that world I've crafted, it lives and it breathes for me, and it's vibrant. It's full of vigor, and it doesn't just go from the city of Lost Peaks. It goes out farther. I've made it a way that it could go out into the stars. It could go out into different dimensions, because I wanted it to be more than just one world. I wanted it to be able to contact others. And if I did crossovers with friends and their creations, I wanted to be able to do that for that simple reason that I didn't want to limit myself. And I hope someday when I finally get it all out and people like it, and it's kind of my legacy to the world as a man. I hope that it can last on after me, and people can enjoy it. And maybe even someday it goes into public domain and people add more. I wouldn't care. I'm not trying to think my IP is inviolate. But that's to each their own. I think I've rambled on rambled on long enough. I hope I haven't bored too many people. Probably have. When I start just kind of going off inside my head. If you have any comments you'd like to make that about if I made any sense, or if you enjoyed my content, please do so. I really do relish feedback and interaction with anybody who wants to talk to me. If you're interested in Lost Peaks and Little Girl Lethal, my upcoming comic book, and hopefully someday soon a novelization version, please tell me about it. Come see me at Slick Jimmy Love on Twitter, and here at Slick Jimmy Speaks on YouTube. And subscribe, ring that bell, as they say, and make sure that you get updates. I'm going to try to do this more often. I would like to get a bit more of a platform, so that when I do release things, people want to indulge in my madness will be able to know about it and have some things to say. So have a great day. It's a beautiful out where I am here in Utah. Go out and be good to your fellow man and those that you love. Have some fun, and take care. Hope all remains good in your life. And we're going off. Bye-bye.